All right, folks, we are back. And about a month or so ago, I was sitting in hosting Making Sense of the Madness for AMP. And I had the pleasure to meet a filmmaker who recently put out a powerhouse of a documentary film. It's called Cut Daughters of the West. And if you go to daughtersofthewestfilm.com, you can learn more about it and how you can stream it. And this guy's been in the game for a lot longer than I knew. He actually has worked with my friend Adam from Dauntless Dialogue. He's going to be coming on the program in the coming weeks as well. And I thought it would be really interesting not only to talk about this film, which is looking at the influence of the media, Hollywood, celebritard culture in general on our children in a way most people won't even whisper. And it's to put them in a state where they're no longer happy with their biology and they're turning towards actually cutting themselves up with plastic surgery as a gateway, if you will, to an even more nefarious agenda. So without further ado, filmmaker Simon Esler is with us to discuss this and so much more. Simon, how has the release of this film been going? Because, let's kick it off there and then get to know you a little bit better. But this is a recent release. I know that you're on tour. You're out there grassroots on the ground showing this at local theaters and in groups. It's something that I was very used to back in my Loose Change, Fabled Enemies, Invisible Empire days, where you got to get on the ground and do those things. Tell us about the reception, because again, this is a powerful film that to me reaches across left or right or any type of political ideology other than trying to keep children safe.
The reception's been really, really good. It has been a powerful response from people who have, I think, been waiting for a film that invites them into a broader understanding of this issue, and that, like you said, can be shown to people on both sides of the aisle, which is specifically why I designed it the way that I did. And so I have had a lot of people reach out and express to me how impactful this film was for them and the extent to which it really communicated how immensely difficult and dangerous it is for girls to try to become healthy women in our society, and really what they've been up against for generations. And so, I've had people reach out from across the world. I've been in touch with some groups in New Zealand who are looking to share this film with their network. They've been working to stand up for women and trying to respond to some of the gender ideology influences over there. I have screenings that are being organized across the United States and here in Toronto. And I think, the reception speaks to what people have been looking for, because I think people are a little bit tapped out in terms of the political rhetoric. People are kind of tired of it being spun as this left or right-wing issue. And it's actually refreshing, I think, even though it's very dark and kind of difficult to confront, it is refreshing for people to start to look at things across generations and to look at the way that cultural trends can unfold slowly over time, and what really happens when we don't pay attention and take control of our culture and take responsibility for it.
And I'm so glad that you put it that way, because gradualism, incrementalism is a tool, in my opinion, of the predator class. They look at things in 5, 10, 20, 100-year increments and slowly but surely make their way into aspects of society that were unimaginable even a decade ago, I would argue, especially in regards to children. And when we talk about the cultural influence over this, it's always ironic to me that right now we're in a society and a culture where we're constantly being told and hammered that this new gender ideology that's amongst children cannot be one of influence, but it's inherent. And meanwhile, you have what they're calling social media influencers. It's literally in the name, promoting this agenda and influencing it. And the only time that we can talk about quote unquote undue influence is when we talk about Russia, and their influence. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. All these years, for instance, of boys generally wanting to be firemen and police officers and astronauts had nothing to do with the culture and play cowboys and Indians. No, it wasn't that. And girls wanting to be princesses and pretty, that wasn't Barbie dolls, etc. Apparently that's all out the window. So what has been this cultural shift where we're supposed to ignore reality and remain ignorant to the agenda that's before us today?
It's this sort of blank slateism that states that absolutely everything is a social construct on the one hand. And so, this is the idea that there's no such thing as sexual dimorphism, which is a really important part of evolution in which, we can comprehend the difference between the sexes in animals and in humans. There's the claim that that doesn't exist. They're doing this, across the whole sort of educational system in North America. It's similar with critical race theory. A lot of these social justice movements have this idea of blank slateism, and it's false for a number of reasons, but mainly because it is divorced from nature. And this has been ongoing for a long time, especially in terms of women's bodies. I think when we look at the way these agendas have treated the actual female form, we get a very, very clear picture of what's going on. So we can look further back in time to the way that birthing culture was dealt with, the way that women were disassociated with their inherent capacity to give birth. It was suddenly treated as this medical emergency. They were suddenly thrown into hospitals as if they didn't have millions of years of evolutionary knowledge surging through them, giving them an understanding of how to bring children into this world before hospitals existed. Not to say that they haven't made it somewhat safer, but it's an example of this divorce from biology. And then we can see it in the way that feminism treated women. So in trying to get women out of the home and into the workforce, it was an absolute divorce from the woman's connection to the child in their developmental years, similar to the way that propaganda was used to push formula into the home to replace breastfeeding. We can see that breastfeeding almost disappeared for about a 50-year period in the United States. Huge impact. And so this whole divorcing from the female form, ignoring the female form, suppressing the female form, this is a big part of what's been going on. And the way I confront this in my film is, really the way that it's been done through cosmetic surgery, because 92% of all cosmetic surgeries are performed on women and girls. This is an industry that has had its eye on women's bodies this entire time and has been normalizing this idea that your body is an obstacle to who you are and you need to modify it to become yourself.
And let's talk about that, because it's gotten to extremes. And oftentimes I see people skirting around the issue that if you're having these issues, whether it be with your gender or your identity, the problem very much is with yourself and how you view yourself and what you're doing in your life in general. Now, there are certain things that biologically we actually can change as human beings. For instance, men can very much change their physical appearance through exercise in a manner that maybe even women can't without really exerting themselves. I mean, women can get in shape, especially if they're out of shape. I'm not saying that, but men can transform themselves and really put themselves into a different state of being. Men can also try different looks. Beards, women can't do that. Mustaches, they can shave their heads. Some of them can grow their hair out, etc. They have more options how they can change themselves biologically, and there's less of a pressure as to what the ideal man is, other than probably strong and muscular, tall, etc. But we've changed that a lot culturally through celebrity and media, I'd argue as well. Women, it's either you're beautiful or you're not. No amount of makeup makes it one way or the other. Yes, that dress and outfit is cute. Yes, that bag, the accessories are always cute. But like you said, there's always been this push that your nose isn't good enough, or your lips need to be bigger. Or right now, the trend is your bottom dollar, where back in the day, it might have been your bustier, right? Talking about breast implants, and now butt implants actually became a thing. And these are all things that are accentuated by the fact that the class that most people worship is the screen class. I won't even call them the television class, because you watch this just as much as that, especially in the youth. And you're watching movie stars and Kardashian reality stars as much as you're watching Instagram social media influencers. But there's a look, and you've got to be that look. Where did it go overboard? Because I very much remember the 1980s, and there was kind of a takeoff towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, with the Barbie look and the breast implant thing, right? And then by the end of the 90s, early 2000s, you did start seeing whispers on talk shows of 16-year-old girls from very wealthy families having this done to them. And now we're at a point, and I'm sure you point this out in the film, that it's not just wealthy families, it's middle class that are under attack as well. And it's extended from like that 16, Sweet 16 thing to much younger.
So what we're looking at here is, first of all, a cosmetic surgery industry that has had a very corrupt moral landscape for a long time, and increasingly corrupt in that, yes, it has aimed itself towards younger and younger and younger women. The growth of the cosmetic surgery industry itself, there was a need for the existing industry of cosmetic surgeons to do something, because coming out of the era of World War I and World War II, which is primarily why we needed cosmetic surgeons, it was to heal people from war. We all of a sudden had a whole industry of plastic surgeons with nothing to do, and with all this advanced new technology, and an entire population of people with disposable wealth. And so there was a great reliance on the cosmetic surgery industry on what cultural trends were going to be. And they have leaned into this very hard. Now, the way it has developed today is that they are able to say, oh, well, these are just cultural trends, and we're just responding to the cultural trends. It's not our fault. If girls are seeing things on TikTok and on movies, it's up to them if they want to come to us, and we'll cut them up, we'll take the money, but it's not really our fault what the cultural trends are. The problem with this is that it's actually really deceptive, because when you look at things like labiaplasty, so that's cosmetic genital surgery, that's one of the things that has been exponentially rising in teenage girls. These medical communities are actively disinforming girls about their anatomy, about their genitalia. So they're trying to say things like, most girls and women have what they call labia minora hypertrophy. So they're claiming that 50 to 60% of women and girls have oversized labia, and that they need to get them cut up anyway. So we're not just dealing with cultural influences, we're dealing with actual medical misinformation and disinformation that has long been misleading women and girls. And we see this as well in the massive number of women now getting explants, because they found out that they have breast implant illness, and that their implants were leaking into their bodies and destroying their health. So the industry that has been doing this to women and girls has not just been relying on these cultural trends, which are produced by a handful of very wealthy elite groups, but also just by misinforming them about their bodies, which again comes back to what I was saying earlier about this long-standing war on the female form.
It's frightening to think that you could have a quote-unquote medical industry, and that's just one of the many reasons that we should remain skeptical of the authoritative medical sources, that would tell you that 50 to 60% of women's genitalia is wrong. Like 50 to 60%, that's insanity on its face. I mean, pure insanity, but it's part of these Bernaysian tools of manipulation, just like Safe and Effective. They have their own statistics. I mean, by whose judgment could that... I don't want to get too grotesque, but like, are we taking out a scale, and what's the measurement for this? Like, why would you ever say something like that to a young, impressionable person other than to first instill fear and then give them the solution to that problem, reaction, solution, right, in which you benefit from. It's a very sociopathic and psychopathic mindset, in my opinion. What, in your opinion, is the time range that this is really taken off? Because we're seeing an explosion not just in the types of surgeries that are focused on in this film, but of course the new gender affirming surgeries. And while the media and most of even the alternative right-wing media is focusing on men and women's sports, the truth is the vast majority of people that are undergoing top surgery and things of that nature are actually young girls. In fact, I've seen statistics upwards of 80% of these surgeries that are taking place on children in this new gender war are happening to women and
Yeah,
girls.
absolutely. This
Yeah.
is one of the things that I point out very distinctly in my film, that we have the rising trends of girls getting the cosmetic genital surgery and the breast implants. That's going up in the early to mid 2000s. Then you insert gender ideology, and it coincides with the introduction of smartphones and social media to a particular age group of girls. We're dealing with pre-high school, so like middle school age girls. This is the first time they were given social media and smartphones. So what happens is you have this rise in cosmetic surgery occurring in these young girls. Then they're given this new form of propaganda. It's extremely powerful. They're being given this propaganda and this technology at an age that is younger than any human being has experienced it. Their mental health crashes. So we see 186% rise in preteen girls being hospitalized because they have cut themselves so severely. And it is around this time that gender ideology is saturating our mainstream culture. It's saturating the classrooms by being introduced into all the school curricula. It's absolutely everywhere while this group of girls is in a mental health crisis. And so what I'm showing in the film is that we see this trend of girls losing their mental health and their connection with their bodies, their ability to become embodied and comfortable in the bodies that they're in. And this is all rising all together at the same time. And one of the reasons it's not political is because the same surgeons that are cutting up their breasts and labia just to make money on that side of things is also cutting off their breasts and giving them testosterone injections based on just a new ideology. And so the moral corruption of these surgeons is not political. They're willing to do it whatever the trend is. And we're seeing this rise primarily in girls, which is important, especially when it comes to gender ideology, which is something I explore in the film. You know, this is exploding in adolescent girls, and that's a brand new phenomenon in the study of gender dysphoria itself. So for decades, all we had was research on gender dysphoria showing up in young boys, in actually preschool age boys. This is where it was most common. All of a sudden, in around 2013 to 2017, you have this window around the world where girls start identifying as trans and seeking these medical treatments, and it skyrockets. It quadrupled in the United States in about 2 years. There was a 4,000% rise in the United Kingdom. So we're looking at a massive, massive increase in this. And even in the study of gender dysphoria, this is a completely new phenomenon. And we know that girls, they are susceptible to social contagions. And we have lots of examples of this throughout history, which is something that I really point out in the film.
And that's the thing. We're not allowed to have quote unquote fads anymore, especially when it comes to this subject, which is insane to me because I'm probably a little bit older than you, 43 years young, but not that much older. And I remember a time of snap bracelets that lasted a couple years. I remember a time of jam pants. Remember the hammer pants, the skids?
Oh, yeah.
If you were rich, like if you had a little extra money, you had the actual skids brand. They were pretty, but we can't talk about that anymore, right? At all. We can't
Yeah.
talk about the fact that we were pushed through Slinky. Oh, what a wonderful toy! Like advertising works. Okay, subliminal messages work. Psychological warfare is real. And you just talked kind of in a broad spectrum of this new global ideology of gender affirming care and gender research that says that there's new science. I have yet to see any new science whatsoever. However, what I do see is the United Nations, for instance, having full fight racism web pages for the LGBTQI plus with bearded women on it. And then they have white papers such as this that you can't make up. Let me just read this for you. This is where we're at today, but it's an ever expanding one. A transgender or trans person may identify as a man, a woman, a trans man, a trans woman, as a non-binary person, or with other terms such as hedra, third gender, two-spirit, travesty, fine, I'm not making that up, gender queer, transpione, mux, waria, and meti. That's just where we're at today. This is an infinite increase in the idea that you need to, again, separate from your biology and identify as whatever you feel at the moment and whatever your imagination can arise to, but not really your imagination. And this is the key. It's the establishment, the predator class imagination that is being imposed and promoted on you. And I believe that that's why we're seeing an explosion right now in this gender ideology aspect. And the other aspect in that white paper is that we're going to protect children with this gender affirming care. So now the children internationally are under the guise of UN protection. And if, say, we sign a treaty, all of a sudden our kids aren't really ours anymore, are they?
Yeah, that's right. We're looking at using gender ideology as a form of Marxist warfare that really does complete the goal of Marxism in terms of breaking up the family unit. So it is being used to strip away parental rights. It is being used to turn children against parents. It's being used to empower the state to take custody of children. We have lots of examples of this that have already come to bear. You know, this is something that I confront in my film. There's a girl named Sage who was coerced by counselors in her school to socially transition. She was subsequently harassed and threatened by boys in her school when she was in the boys' bathroom because she was told she must be a boy based on how she was feeling. This is a young girl with a long history of mental health issues and abuse who was struggling deeply. So she ends up running away. She gets sex trafficked. She gets pulled into a child sex trafficking ring. She is eventually rescued by the FBI, but when her parents are called to come get her, they're told they can't see her because her case has been taken up by a radical gender ideologue lawyer who is trying to use her case to set precedent to state that because her parents wouldn't affirm her new identity, they should lose custody of her. So she ends up being pulled into this absurd battle. When she is on the verge of finally getting home, she finds out that the lawyer has filed an emergency order to keep her out of her parents' custody. She realizes she's been caught in the middle of this whole thing. She runs away again. She is trafficked again for a second time. Now, in this entire instance, she was being kept in a boys' foster home. So imagine a teenage girl with mental health issues is living with a bunch of teenage boys in a foster home. Then she runs away, is trafficked again. And it's important to note that there seems to be an element of this that is tied up in the human trafficking world in which trans children are going for more money on the human trafficking market. So there is a benefit to doing this. So she is finally rescued a second time. She is finally brought home to her family. She is now a detransitioner because, of course, this was all nonsense. But the case is a good example of all the radically, ideologically subverted adults that were surrounding her who, even though she was a rape victim, did nothing to get her therapy or healing for having been raped as a child throughout this whole experience. And instead, they were obsessed with affirming her identity and trying to force her parents to affirm her identity. And the judge actually did attempt to compel speech and try to force the parents to use her pronouns. So, you know, I go through that case in the film as a good example of all of this, but that is being duplicated across North America right now.
It's hard to really, I guess, accentuate the gravity of these situations, because when you talk about that, it just seems so dark on so many levels, you know, from the abuse as a child level, which we don't discuss enough in society, especially when we're talking about a lot of the people that eventually do become abusers were once abused. That used to be commonplace and talked about. We didn't embrace it, by the way. And again, to not acknowledge that that isn't part of this, it's very much a part of this. And then you talked about mental health issues. And society has changed so much over my generation where it is now commonplace not only to have the types of surgeries that you talk about in Cut, Daughters of the West happening, but you're also handing out psychotropic drugs en masse to minors. And you also talked about the autistic aspect of this and how some of these people are either mentally unstable, obviously medicated on the autistic spectrum, and that's even without the sexual abuse. How does that now come into play when you have a lot of these people that obviously there's something wrong, right? They're going and saying they feel this way for a reason, but they're on psychotropic, brain-changing medications, Simon.
Well, you have pressure in the medical community, especially coming from groups like WPATH. So WPATH is supposed to be this global authority on the whole trans issue. They have, since 2010, been pushing for the depathologization of gender incongruent people, which means they're asking for there to be less mental health assessment, less looking at this as a mental health issue. They are part of the push to say that gender dysphoria is not a mental illness, even though there's decades of science showing that it really, really is. And so the push to stop pathologizing gender incongruence is a big part of this, because you have the medical community actually being afraid to include a mental diagnosis in this because it's actually being called transphobic. There is even a surgeon here in Toronto who has now started removing the breasts of healthy girls based on the idea that they are just feeling non-binary. There is no therapist note required. There is no mental health check required at all. As long as she can give just a basic checkup from her general practitioner in terms of her health, and she identifies as non-binary, he will remove her healthy breasts. He has stated himself, I don't try to understand it anymore. This is just the kids today, and so I'm willing to help them how they want. This is the result of groups like WPATH saying, stop psychopathologizing any of this and just allow this to be a new kind of person. The biggest danger to this is that they are trying to establish trans people as a special class of people so that they can get civil rights status. And that is when the major restructuring of our society occurs. That is the biggest danger of all of this. If they can completely remove all the mental health gatekeeping and make it seem like some people are just born trans and they can't help it, they suddenly get the civil rights status, and then we look at a whole bunch of changes that are very hard to take back.
And I don't think that they ever will be taken back. And I think a lot of this has to do not just with the sexualization of children, as you talked about, not even just to do with the fact that they want an autonomy of a very, very impressionable young individual to escape the nuclear family, to take away parental rights and erode the idea of the nuclear family altogether. But this is also a road to transhumanism on so many levels. For instance, I have a book here called Unzipped Genes. It's from 1997. It's written by the most powerful and rich transgender person on the planet, Martine Rothblatt. And in this very opening, when they start talking about what they're going to do, because this is taking charge of baby making in the new millennium, it's not eugenics anymore. Yeah, eugenics was kind of bad because we did it by race, but there are a lot of aspects in it we all practice, right? We all want to change things, just like Martine did. And they actually refer to it as transgenics throughout the book. And wow. Rothblatt is also the author years later in, I believe it's 2012, From Transgender to Transhuman. Virtually Human is another one of their books. And this is somebody that gets the awards from the NGOs that Martine hasn't set up, because a lot of those NGOs are hers, but gets the Billie Jean King Award. Also heavy into technology, NASA, satellites, you name it. There seems to be this overlap in this trans movement with people like this who are also in kind of the transhumanist frontrunner biomimetics movement. So they're into technology and they're into biology, and you just discussed how they want to make a third class of people. Well, if you start taking over baby making, you could have somebody who's genetically engineered to be quote unquote non-binary from the very beginning. So not necessarily have the genitalia of either a man or a woman. You know, what are your thoughts on that bridge? Because we've ignored, for instance, one of the amazing things that Martin Rothblatt is able to do, especially in the follow-up book in this, is in the beginning, Rothblatt says that we're going to look at you marking down male or female on a baby when it's born, like we looked at South African apartheid when you marked somebody white or black. That's insanity, of course, but real. And then also makes the argument that the chromosome argument isn't real because we obviously have people with a third chromosome. It doesn't matter that they are literally mentally and physically retarded. And unfortunately, an anomaly I believe we shouldn't encourage. We should try to stop that. Thoughts, Simon? I know that's a lot.
Well, there's a lot to say there, though, and I've created a lot of content exploring a ton of this and trying to respond to a lot of it. There are some documents called the Toronto Protocols that I have been researching for years, and they outline a very, very detailed warfare strategy on the Western world in terms of implementing a new world order. And one of the things they state in these meetings that were allegedly had in Toronto in 1967 and then again in Toronto in 1985 is that they are going to use two primary things for a lot of the social engineering that's going to be ongoing against the youth and against our legal system, which is norms and exceptions. And so what they are looking to do is try to make the exception the norm so that they can modify the legal system to uplift the exceptions and force that upon everyone. This is what we're seeing with transgenderism, of course, because the exception here is the very, very tiny number of people who were transgender a while ago. It was like less than 0.01% of the population, very, very small. So they're now trying to uplift this exception and make it the norm and try to modify the entire human rights code across the world in all these countries according to the exception. So this is one of the fundamental warfare strategies they outline in the Toronto Protocols. When we look at doing that and bringing us in the direction of transhumanism, it requires a lot of the same things, and it requires the war on the family, especially in terms of ignoring what really happens biologically when a traditional family unit is formed. And this is something that I looked at extensively in my series Superorganism, that was looking at the family unit as a superorganism, because I wanted to respond to the war on the family using insights into biology and psychology and spirituality. And some of the things I found, they directly undermine this transhumanist push. So when we look at, there was recently a video that came out that was promoting this baby factory. I think it was in Germany, where they're looking to grow all the babies in
Ecto-life. We covered it.
Right. That's right. So the ecto-life push, this is a good example. They're saying they can imitate the creation of the baby, and they can imitate the experience of the baby inside the mother's womb. And I'll give some examples as to why they are not even close to imitating the actual majesty of a man and a woman making a child. So when a man impregnates a woman, if that man is devoted to that woman during pregnancy, meaning if he is present during the actual time of gestation and he's around her physical vehicle, she's emitting what is essentially a biofield that is starting to reprogram the man's body. And it creates changes in his actual physical vehicle. It creates changes in his emotional landscape. There are things that are measurably changed. For example, one of the things they found is that men who are pregnant or who are with the pregnant woman and near her and devoted to that pregnancy, they would have a rise in what's called prolactin. And they found that the men who had this increase in prolactin that was caused by the pregnant woman's body, that man's body would be more responsive to his baby's cries after his child was born. They also found that the first moment that a man holds his newborn child, his testosterone levels drop by about 33%, changing his emotional landscape and opening him up to a deeper emotional connection with his child. At the same time, the woman, her body is undergoing, of course, immense changes, which we know lots about. But one of the incredible things they found is that the child's body itself becomes devoted to protecting the mother's body, to the extent that they were finding that women were healing from heart attacks at a rate that was seemingly impossible. Some of these pregnant women, they were healing from heart attacks in under 2 weeks, and they couldn't figure out why. And when they looked into what was happening and causing their hearts to completely recover from these heart attacks, they found the genetic material of their child. That is the DNA of their child, not the woman. And they found that the baby's genetic materials were leaving the womb, actually crossing the placental walls and taking up positions within the woman's organs and her tissue all across her body. And that the baby's DNA was actually repairing the mom's heart. We know now from things like this that the complex relationship that is occurring here with man, woman, and child is not something that transhumanism is duplicating. We know that the heart field generated by the mom when the child is in the womb and how coherent the mother's heart states are, this is teaching the child forms of self-regulation, types of consciousness. It's giving the child information that is beyond language. And that even occurs after the child is born. The first 9 months, just being in the mom's heart field is programming the child in all these non-linguistic ways. None of this is imitated by these wacky experiments like Ectolife, because they can't even come close to all these incredible things occurring with the man, woman, child combination. And that's why I looked into this into superorganism, because I knew that if I looked at the family as this superorganism designed to generate human knowledge and wisdom and beauty, that it would undermine this whole war on the family, which relies on it just as a social construct.
Well, that's the deal, man. Let's talk about that, because they want everything to be, like you said, a social construct. There's nothing that's inherent, right? There's no inherent good or evil. Everything's based on societal mores, etc. But what they're in my opinion, when they're talking about transhumanism, they want the Ectolife factory, because they do want to even, then we're not going to take away the humans. We're actually going to make them better for a price. But they want to detach you as much from that experience and put it under government regulation if they allow you to have it. Meanwhile, you just talked about something, how a child and a mother's symbiosis is genetically there. Well, transhumanism to these people are, one, eventually they want to trick all of us after we've accepted chips and biomimetics and even mRNA type organisms, which is a gateway into that we can upload our consciousness to their super metaverse or whatever. Totally false. But then they'd like to biologically live forever by cracking the human code. And people like Peter Nygard, for instance, are some of the most grotesque examples of that, where Nygard is in prison right now awaiting trial, where he was literally impregnating girls as young as 14 so that they would have abortions, and he would take the stem cells from those aborted fetuses and inject them into his own body because they shared his same genetics. We also know that Jeffrey Epstein had a baby-making ranch in Zorro, New Mexico, that was never really looked at, never investigated. Bannon has 16 hours of tape with the guy. I've seen 2 seconds of it in his trailer where he asked him about the island of Dr. Moreau, and he's like, that's correct. Anybody who knows what that is, that's chimeric organisms being created outside of the rule of law. What are your thoughts on what the predator class, the elites, think transhumanism is? And do you think that it's even possible that they could biologically live forever? Or is that the big goof and trick on them?
I don't think that any of us are destined to live forever. I am firmly of the belief that it is, death as a form of accompaniment throughout life is part of what balances existence. This shamanic notion that death is your guide, that death is guiding you throughout life. To me, it is part of the balance of things. And I believe these people are deeply afraid of death. And the tragedy is that they are permeating the exploration of existence and of the material realm with their sickness, with their fear of death, with their philosophy. And it doesn't need to be that way. I don't think it's inherently wrong to be exploring these things and trying to understand the human form more deeply. So perhaps we could live longer, healthier lives. That's not inherently wrong. The issue is that they have a warped spirituality or a warped version of existence that they're living from that is polluting these ideas. There's an interview, or an alleged interview, I should say, that I saw long ago that was supposedly with an extraterrestrial, and they were asking this extraterrestrial about the different ways that their civilization had developed technology and spirituality. And the extraterrestrials' supposed response in this interview was, we don't view those as separate things. They are the same thing. So for their civilization, allegedly, their path to spiritual evolution was also the way that they had produced their technologies. Here, in our civilization, these are seemingly separate things as far as we are shown in the world. You have this materialist path, and then you have, the sort of path to spiritual evolution. And so we end up with this struggle of, on the one hand, with this highly intellectual, sort of detached push to develop technology. All we do is ask, is it possible? And we only explore, is it possible? And we never balance that with, is it appropriate? And these can even be seen as sort of a archetypal masculine and feminine, way of looking at things. This is something that Joseph Chilton Pearce talks a lot about, that you have a feminine kind of intelligence and then a masculine kind of intellect driving our society. And one of the biggest issues we've had is this constant asking, is it possible, and never asking, is it appropriate? This is the danger with this small group of wealthy people who they're able to do this because they keep a line of knowledge and a line of intention. They keep warfare operations alive generation after generation while they wage the war on the family, specifically so that we cannot do that. This is another thing that's stated in the Toronto Protocols, that they want to attack the family unit so that wisdom and knowledge cannot move from generation to generation. While they also state that's precisely what we're keeping for our families, that's exactly how we've been able to unfold this plan over hundreds of years. So that's one of the reasons I want to fight back to create cultural ideals of the family and the family as this superorganism, to pass on knowledge as far into the future as we can into the generations. And one of the things we should be doing in passing on knowledge is not only asking, is it possible, but what is appropriate, and how do we balance that moving forward as a culture, especially one that we don't want to be controlled by this centralized motion or the centralized organization of cultural production.
Kind of going back a little bit to what you said in general about technology, right? And how it's separated from our spiritual nature as well. First of all, I'm totally skeptic. I probably watched that same interview that you're talking about of anything alien. I think if not all of it is disinformation and misinformation. I mean, it's out there. But what is undeniable to me, for instance, is there seems to be a spiritual, religious, occultic, and symbolism to many of the societies and institutions politically that have come into power over generations, and even in modern generations. The Nazis, for instance, obviously the Vril Society and the Black Sun, and the look for what they really believed was a hollow earth and the entities within, not so much looking for space aliens, but some people, again, the speculation there is maybe they got them. Then you move into the Western aspect of this, and the entire nuclear program that actually becomes successful is kind of spawned out of the Bohemian Grove, where you have this occultic ritual that spans even before the great owl is there, and there's a Buddha, and even before the Buddha's there in the forest. I actually have their annals. There's old school pictures, 100 years old, and writings about it. And the cremation of care is one where they dress in druidic garb and they do a ritual burning their consciousness, essentially, for that group goal that you've alluded to in these Toronto protocols. And so to me, when I actually look at this, the power structure that has really compartmentalized things in a manner that I don't think is imaginable post-World War II. Things have leaked out like the Gateway process. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that document. There's a document that talks kind of about the mental and spiritual aspects of reality in relation to technology as well. I think a lot of that's been hidden from us. And I think the people at the very top understand that, and they integrate that in their fifth generational warfare. And then if you start talking about it, you're a kook, you're a new ager. But I happen to believe in the law of attraction. I think it's very, very real. Now, that doesn't mean that if I think something hard enough, it's going to happen. You have to put yourself into motion and action on top of those thoughts. And it's in repetition. And eventually the universe does answer. And that is something spiritual to me. I'd say even Annie Jacobson's books, they focus heavily on technology, but she's got the book Phenomenon, where she specifically looks at our military-industrial complex and them looking at the psychic nature of some of this stuff. I think there's a problem. You got a lot of grifters in there, right? Like Uri Geller, ultimate grifter. And he's a guy that was in the Central Intelligence Agency, working for the Mossad at the same time, and now literally has his own island in Israel that he's giving citizenship to. So I think there's a lot of muddying of the waters. I think that when a smart guy like you puts something like this out and then starts talking about the spiritual aspect, they'll go after that first, right? That's the way to discredit you. And that's unfortunate because this is something that they've also explored, and it is something we need to have a conversation about, because just like you said, the family, the nuclear family, it's a super organism, man. It's unlike anything else. And a lot of that is our inherent biology. In fact, I think that we pass things down other than looks through generations. And obviously we do. We have our lizard brain, our fight or flight. That's bare minimum. But it's undeniable that traits from a father or a grandfather or an aunt or an uncle aren't imposed, imprinted on the youth. They absolutely are, and we've seen that throughout history, and we fail to recognize that on many levels. And I think that could be the bridge for people to understand the spiritual aspect of everything we're going through right now, Simon.
Yeah, absolutely. We have an opportunity here to use our understanding of family and of the way that knowledge moves through the generations to build a wealth of spiritual knowledge. And I think what it's going to come down to is honoring the individual, the unique individual on deeper and deeper levels. Ironically, I think that's what's going to unite us as a collective against all of these people. And I think that seems to be a big part of what's going on. For me, one of the core things that I'm looking to pass on to my children is the capacity to think freely and to develop your internal authority, your ability to guide yourself through your life in the way that is unique to you. And I think this is where a lot of our spiritual systems were corrupted or used improperly. They were used to homogenize. There's examples of this in the family where sometimes the family unit was used to impose dogma onto children to replace free thinking. And, free thought is antithetical to using dogma and authority and tradition, right? We should be using free thought as a foundation. And then sometimes when dogma, authority, or tradition are helpful to guide us, they can be secondary. So I think in terms of developing ourselves spiritually as a species, it's going to be about honoring the development of the individual to a level that we have yet to see. And this is naturally where it's going with the collapse of all the systems that we're seeing around us, right? We're seeing the collapse of the education system, of the healthcare system, even the financial system. All of these things are collapsing. And I think in a sense, because they were based on homogenization, they were based on trying to create groupthink, tribalism, collectivism in ways that no longer serve us. And so now we're moving into this era where I think everything is going to be more decentralized. But spiritually speaking, that has the opportunity, I think, to develop the potential within the individual to a much greater capacity. I know this to be true in the educational path we've taken with our children. We're an unschooling family, so we're not even looking to imitate the schooling model. We are looking to study our children so deeply that it's clear to us what their needs and interests are, and then we surround them with what their needs and interests are, and we allow who they are to dictate their life path and how they are educated. And that's very, very different from the public schooling model, which was founded, out of the Prussian model that was designed to create just obedient soldiers and non-thinking bureaucrats. That was the whole purpose of that system. So I think our spirituality needs to be reconciled with this focus on honoring the individual. And to me, that will correct a lot of the operations and infiltrations that occurred within religions. We had infiltration into Christianity, and we have strange forms of corruption even in Buddhism that I think really misled people. I think a lot of the New Age community is full of different kinds of psychological operations to muddy the waters. And so when it becomes about honoring the individual very, very deeply, I think that becomes a means of protecting ourselves against those kinds of operations, because they specifically rely on groupthink and kinds of tribalism that I don't think are going to serve us as things, we go through this great awakening in this big societal shift.
I'm so glad you said all those things about really collectivism, right? Because I hear people batten down the hatches on socialism and communism. But at the end of the day, even in Samuel Zane Batten's book, New World Order, it's about collectivism. That's why G. Edward Griffin is so brilliant in identifying that. And that's why the rugged individual, and it's really that individual spirit, is so important, and the individual's rights. And that's why the Constitution in itself is an incredible document, because it's perfectly imperfect. It didn't get it all right, but it gave you a way to change it, and it was Batten for the little guy, because the little guy matters, and individuals matter. That doesn't mean that you can't work together. That doesn't mean you can't love your neighbor. It encourages those situations for you to collectively work together when it's beneficial to all. Okay, and that's what they never ever point out. You released this film several weeks ago, maybe even a month ago now. How can people see it? Where are you on the road? How can they support you right now? Cut, Daughters of the West, and daughtersofthewestfilm.com is where you can find everything out about it.
Yeah, so if you go to daughtersofthewestfilm.com, that will give you access to renting and purchasing the film. There's also an opportunity to screen the film in your community. So I've created a section on the website so that you can apply to create a screening in your community. I really encourage that element of it, because in fifth generation warfare, a lot of the operations being waged against us are in the digital domain. So there's a lot of cyber warfare, and there's a lot of psychological operations and psyacs, and all of this is dependent upon corrupt social media platforms, corrupt news outlets, the manipulation of the digital domain in general. So when we create events that are in person, in aura, in community, that actually allows us to dominate the physical domain and avoid a lot of the forms of manipulation that are naturally going to occur when we are in the digital theater of war that is, necessarily going to be saturated by our enemy's operations. So that is one thing that you can do. I would say that it's important to note that if you purchase or rent Daughters of the West, you'll actually get a bonus feature, which is Vague Rules, which is a film that I wrote and Adam Riva actually edited. And Vague Rules shows people the connection to old forms of communist warfare, starting right in the history of China, that are being used here in the West by big tech, that are being used to implement critical race theory, gender ideology, that were used during the COVID lockdowns. And it sort of connects this form of communist warfare through all of those things. So that is a bonus feature that you'll get along with Screening Cut. And if you want to look at the rest of my work, you can go to simonessler.com. That'll show you my whole portfolio. You'll get to look into my series Superorganism, and then I have a number of comedy specials and shows and different things on Rise TV as well.
So how's a guy like you get started? Let's close it out with that. Like, what was that moment that you were just kind of fed up, or that piece of information that was too much, that you decided, hey, ignorance is not bliss. Now that I understand this, I can't just be a spectator. I can't just be on the sidelines. I got to go out and do something. You choose to make content, films. I love that you're talking about getting on the ground and talking to people and getting out of the house and holding screenings, getting away from this screen. The screen's great. The typing's great. The sharing's great. I promise you, a handshake is better. An interaction with that person is better. And anywhere you can do it, outside, on a projector, on a big screen, inside a church, at your local community center. If you've got a big house, you can have a screening with 15 people. So once again, how'd you get started, brother?
Well, I experienced a lot of censorship early on, probably around 2017, 2018. At the time, I was building a free-thinking think tank on Facebook that got up to about 14,000 members. And we were pretty serious in what we were doing. We were very evidence-based, and we were responding to the official narratives, I think, in a way that was a big threat. That group got purged. I got kicked off of Facebook. My partner Amanda got kicked off just for being connected to me. And then all of a sudden, I was getting shadow banned everywhere else. At the time, I had actually been working more in the ufology space. I had been hired to do a couple different conferences, and I was approached by a platform which at the time was Edge of Wonder. They're now Rise TV. They approached me to develop a series, and that was my invitation into making some professional level content. And I figured at the time, instead of grinding against the shadow banning and going against this algorithm that was targeting me, why not refine my skills as a content creator in these private communities that are freedom oriented, where there wasn't going to be any censorship. And so I took that as an opportunity to work on my craft and to develop my ability to develop docuseries. And even, as I said, I've got some comedy content as well. So I spent half a decade just really, really learning how to make high quality content. I built a 4K studio here in my home in Toronto. And that was really exciting for me because it helped me get everything up to the level that I wanted it to be. It helped me figure out how to control everything myself, how to take a project from beginning to end on my own. And so, Cut, Daughters of the West, is my first independently released project. Everything else has been behind the paywalls of these platforms that I've been working with for the past 5 or 6 years. This is the first time where I've decided to take something from beginning to end on my own and release it on my own as well. And it's been a really satisfying experience because, I personally, I like to be a one-man show. I like to write and direct and perform everything myself. And it's been damn satisfying, I got to say. And it's addictive. I'm definitely going to be doing another film soon. And I look forward to expanding my reach beyond the platforms that I've been, the beneficiary of working with for so long now.
I'm so with you, man. As an independent filmmaker myself, listen, it's great to have a little bit of help. It's great to have this and that. But when it's down to it, the more you're doing yourself, the more you're on the ground, the more you're doing the edits, the more you're watching that same 5 minutes for the 100th time, the better it ends up coming out. I applaud you, man. I love what you're doing. You're welcome on the show anytime for any of the projects. We need more people like you. And as always, folks, you know the drill. You can support the broadcast with the links down below. Please go check out his film. This isn't about right or left. It is about right and wrong every single time. I love you guys, and I will see you all on the flip side.